Good afternoon. My name is Mike Carney, and we're here in Indianapolis, Indiana for the ASHRAE annual meeting, and it's my pleasure to interview this afternoon Mr. Lou Flagg, who was president of the Society from 1988 through 89. Lou, how are you today?
I'm fine, Mike, and it's a delight to be here.
Good.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We thank you for coming. We generally start out by letting you have an opportunity to give us a little background about Lou Flagg, where he came from in the country, and how you got into the engineering profession, how you got started in this business.
Okay. Well, I was born in Maine, but I didn't stay there very long. It was pre-World War I, and my family found it rather hard to make a living in Maine during World War I, and they moved to Washington, D.C. when I was 4 years old. Okay. So I grew up in the capital and went through all of my schooling there, including the University of Maryland. I was encouraged to become an engineer because I was pretty good in math and science, and my parents thought probably I ought to think engineering. Early on I thought I might go to MIT, but there was a little thing called a depression going on, so didn't quite make that. But went to the University of Maryland, took electrical engineering, got out in 1936. Depression was still on, things were a little tough. Was lucky to get a job with a distributor of Honeywell, at that time called the Minneapolis Honeywell Regulator Company, based in Minneapolis, but I was working in Washington, D.C. as a sales engineer for electric controls.
Electric, okay.
And as an electrical engineer, that fit.
Okay.
But before I was in there a year, they bought out a pneumatic control company.
Okay.
And I was up to my you-know-what in pneumatic controls and copper tubing and all that kind of stuff. And my electrical engineering kind of got set aside, and I specialized then in control engineering.
I see you mentioned control and service. In that time, were you also involved in the actual installation and applying the controls on a job?
Yes, they hired me as a sales engineer, but their on-the-job training was to put you into installing and servicing.
I see.
And I did that for a little while, and the guy in charge of service and installation liked what I did so much that he decided he wanted to ask for me to do it on a permanent basis. So first 5 years of my career, I was really a supervisor in the service and installation business. And among the interesting things I ran into was I was less than a year out of college in charge of the largest control job in the world at that time, the Senate office building.
Oh, man.
200 thermostats. Many problems, many fan systems. Fascinating. Jobs in the government printing office, Bureau of Printing and Engraving, National Institute of Health. Some of you heard of Bethesda Naval Hospital,
yes,
where the...
Been there.
You've been there, okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Those are jobs that I helped with in one way or another.
Is that right? Well, in Washington, D.C., you can certainly find jobs of high visibility and prestige, and you were obviously on several. And what happened in your career next is what? World War I?
World War II came along. I'm pretty old, but not quite old enough to get into World War I.
Poor interview.
It's all right. I brag about the fact I'm 77 now, so don't worry about that. World War II came along. I had, in the University of Maryland, become a reserve officer in the infantry, which was the only service they had available there. By that time, I was first lieutenant, got called up to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for the 39th Infantry to become a communications officer.
Fit in with your electrical background.
Fit in with the electrical background.
Okay.
Never did actually get to do much infantry work. And things moved so fast then that I got promoted to captain. I went overseas into the invasion of North Africa as a commanding officer of Headquarters Company, 39th Infantry,
I see.
which was communications, intelligence, supply, and taking care of the officers. Managed to get transferred to the Signal Corps over in North Africa, and that's too long a story for this interview. It was a wonderful experience for me. Went from Algiers back to Oran and spent a couple years in North Africa totally.
I see. After World War II, you got back into, what, the controls?
Came
again?
back from the service as a lieutenant colonel in the Signal Corps, and didn't have the opportunity of staying in, wouldn't have anyway. And I applied directly to Honeywell for a sales engineering job. So got that and worked in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years. Then they decided to take advantage of my 5 years of service and installation training and made me manager of service and installation. The first one they had, incidentally, for a region, 13 branches on the East Coast.
Gee.
Based out of New York. Spent a couple of years there.
In New York City?
In New York City.
I see.
Last place in the world I wanted to go to, but first place Honeywell sent me. Enjoyed my 2 years there, but was glad when they called me to Minneapolis to be in charge of training for our division.
Okay. Was it during this time that you got started in the ASHRAE Society?
Yes. I got into ASHRAE when I was a sales engineer in Washington for Honeywell in 1947.
1947, okay.
And was involved with the chapter there in what's now the National Capital Chapter. Didn't do much with it in New York because I was spending my time on the road with the 13 branches. But you know, I was there, but didn't do much. Then when I got out to Minneapolis, I got back in the ASHRAE activities.
Okay, you went from now New York City up to Minneapolis with Honeywell.
Right.
Okay.
That was an interesting story in itself, you know, but not particularly ASHRAE oriented. I had never been to the school in Minneapolis, and I commented to somebody, I guess the only way I'm ever going to get to see that school is to offer to teach in it. Months later, I was teaching in the school, and 3 months later, I was asked to come out and be in charge of it. So
You must have handled
that's
that
how I
very
got
well.
to Minneapolis.
Well, in Minneapolis, then you started more involvement in the ASHRAE Society, I imagine.
Yes, we had a vice president of our division that was in the chairs of ASHRAE at that time, John Haynes.
Okay.
And we had just also a vice president in Canada, John Fox, who was, I think, on the board of directors at the time. I've lost track of the specific timing between those two, but anyway, but they had Honeywell pretty well charged to give attention to ASHRAE. And when we were asked to help with a chapter on controls in what was then called the Guide, it's the early version of our current handbook, they looked around to see who they might pick, and they picked me. So I got to work on the ASHRAE Guide in the early 50s, probably about 1953.
Super. That's an important legacy, the encouragement of principals in a firm like Honeywell.
Right.
To young engineers to be involved in the ASHRAE process. ASHRAE really is a process in many respects.
Then they encouraged me to get more involved, and I ended up with a program and my first society-level meeting in Murray Bay, Canada, 1957, and a couple of interesting things there. A, I was really a freshman in this whole thing, and I was on the same program with Jack Chaddock, who became a president long before I did. And he and I often talk about that wonderful experience. And I was also alone. And there was a guy named Haywood Murray from Canada. is a real old-timer in this organization. It just took me in, and he and his family had me at their dinner table and breakfast table, and he came to the Honeywell suite. We used to have suites at that time for entertaining the customers, and he was great there, so we created a long friendship. And he just the other day attended the nominating committee orientation session that I conducted. And I told that story at that session, and he really got a kick out of that.
Yes, I met Mr. Murray yesterday for the first time, and I hope to be involved in interviews like this of that splendid character. He's one of the great heritages we have in ASHRAE, I can tell.
You really do have an opportunity there, because if there's anyone that believes in what ASHRAE can do for an individual any more than Hay Murray, I don't know who it is. He's terrific.
We've got him on the list. We hope we can conduct one of these type interviews with him sometime soon.
Great.
Well, all right. So you're a young engineer, and you've somehow gotten into the controls business with your double E background, and now you're beginning to work within the ASHRAE technical committees, or just you gave a paper one time?
I gave a paper, but I was still working on the
control,
so-called guide, and moved from working on the chapter on controls to a member of the guide committee.
Okay.
And then riding a company airplane to one of the ASHRAE meetings, the president at that time, Jack Everett, asked me to serve on a society level committee. It happened to be the advertising committee, which was my open experience to some of that kind of stuff, the different aspects of publications. And there's a story about Jack that you need to hear.
Okay.
When I was in New York, one of the troubleshooting functions I had was to go to Richmond, Virginia, to a job down there where we had some serious valve troubles. And it was a Charlie Leopold job. Charlie Leopold is the engineer that did the Pentagon, in case those who are viewing this later want to know about him. And story had it that he could do no wrong. Don't challenge Charlie Leopold. So Jack Everett and a young guy right out of school named Walter Spiegel.
Walter Spiegel.
Were on that job, and they told me that the valve was too small and we were going to have to replace it. And I asked my engineer how he'd sized it, and he told me, and I said, well, Jack and Walter, I don't know what the problem is, but the valve's not undersized. And they said, but your own salesman in Philadelphia says it's undersized. And I said, well, believe me, it's not undersized. So I got a ladder and climbed up and vented the air out of the system, and the valve came down and delivered rated capacity. And Walt Spiegel thought I was a genius. I still think maybe my having been president might relate in some way to the fact that I impressed Walt Spiegel and Jack Everett, who were later presidents of the ASHRAE.
I see. With one valve stroke.
With one valve stroke.
Well,
I always like to tell that story, Mike.
Well, I don't know if we should recommend that as a career path of advancement in ASHRAE, but it's a thought we could.
When I told that to somebody, they said, what are the odds of 3 past presidents of ASHRAE being on the same job before they were ever president?
That's very interesting.
Interesting, yeah. A little bit of history.
Just
there.
about on the same ladder.
Yeah.
Just literally on the same ladder.
Right.
Well,
I may have got you off your path.
No, it's your path.
After Jack Everett asked me to serve, then I just spent the next basically 10 years on what was then called the Guide and Data Book Committee, because we'd gone through the merger process, merging ASH-V and ASRE, ASH-A and ASRE into ASHRAE, and we combined the old data book of ASRE with the guide of ASH-A, and called it Guide and Data Book. And I ended up being chairman of that 1968 or some such thing.
Okay, would that correspond now to what is the Publishing Council?
That's the handbook.
Okay, just the handbook.
Just the handbook committee.
Okay.
And I went right out of chairman of that to vice chairman of the journal committee.
Okay.
And then chairman. And out of that to vice chairman of the publishing committee. Before we had councils, publishing committee was kind of the equivalent of publishing council today.
I see.
And I chaired that a couple of years. So I was really in the publishing business for several years there.
That's interesting. With your technical background and in your career being so much involved in the technology of controls, your walk in ASHRAE was really in the publishing aspects of the society.
Sure, but not totally off base, because after I went to Minneapolis to be in training, we were in a very rapid growth situation after World War II. The whole industry was.
Yes.
And the first thing you know, they were looking for people to take on assignments, and I got technical publications before you could say Jack Robinson. So I had technical publications at Honeywell. It fit in very nicely with the technical publications work I did at ASHRAE.
Oh, I see. So it was a nice fit.
Nice fit.
Yes. Okay.
Then, from there on, I've been on committees and so on ever since. It went, I can't even remember the sequence for sure, but it went, I think, from publishing committee to finance committee, and somewhere in there I was on program committee and then R&T committee.
I would assume that you never looked to walk up the chairs to be president, but somehow they looked at you. Can you remember how that process might have started?
I think they may have been looking at me at the time they appointed me to the finance committee, but they didn't ask those questions. They didn't say, we'd like to appoint you to the finance committee so you can ultimately become president. But it was interesting that many of the people who got on the finance committee were taken off suddenly to become treasurer.
Oh, I see.
By one point in time, they asked me would I like to be considered for a director and regional chairman, and Honeywell said, that's too much time out of your work pattern, and we can't afford to let you take that much time off right now. You can be a director at large, but not a director and regional chairman. So I did get put on the board as a director at large back in the early 80s. And I think the nominating committee assumed at that time that it was over and done with as far as my getting to be president.
Yesterday at the luncheon, when you were bringing people up to the dais, you referred to this technology council. I'm eager to hear about the synergism that went on there.
Yes, we had a technology council that was just out of this world, and when I chaired it, I had a group of people, 4 of whom I installed as members of the board of directors yesterday at lunch. And I really believe that sort of backup that I had in that situation created all kinds of wonderful things for ASHRAE and for me personally. It certainly enhanced my enthusiasm for going on to be president of the society, and apparently enhanced their enthusiasm for going on too. So the people that served on that technology council either came there by way of being on standards committee or being on research and technical committee, or had previously served somewhere in the society that led them to be appointed directly to the council. Some of them were directors at large at the time, and some of them were just specifically members of the council.
I see. Now this is the Technology Council.
Technology Council, which is an arm of the board of directors. And it's the one that oversees research and technical Committee, the Research Promotion Committee, the Refrigeration Committee, the Environmental Health Committee, and I probably left one out.
A number of issues.
And they're really key technological issues for the society. And so those people that come up through that channel are the cream of the crop in the society, so to speak. And the ones that I put in yesterday are Billy Manning, my goodness, Faye McQuiston, Jules Olson, who was the other one?
I don't know if I can help you on that.
I'll think of it.
But we'll maybe get back to that and get that fourth name. But the point is that from work on that in the Technology Council, that has proved, at least yesterday at noon, to be a real good breeding ground for men and persons of stature within the society. Yeah.
And then some of the other related people that weren't there, like our incoming president, Don Rich, got into the technology area through the Research and Technical Committee, and he was one of the early ones on what preceded the Technology Council, which was the Research Administration Council. And he was key in that, and so it was great to see that relationship. And even Dick Charles, who came up through the Director and Regional Chairman and is going in as President-elect, interfaced with us because he was involved with energy issues, and we had him on what was called Growth Scenarios Committee that was a subcommittee of the Technology Council. So somebody kidded me today saying, hey, the other councils are important too. You shortchanged them. And I didn't mean to do that, but I just thought it was fascinating that I had this council with those wonderful people.
Sure. I think we do that in sales every now and then. Look back a few years and see people who at one time were all together on one team, and now they are presidents of different companies or in key positions in a number of different companies. And it's interesting to see that fabric weave itself in our technology.
Yes.
Okay, let's get to your presidency now. And you've worked hard on committees in the areas of publishing, and now over in this Technology Council. At some point in time, then you got on the Finance Committee, or was that?
That was
prior to. So you'd been on the Finance Committee, and somewhere
as a member of the Executive Council, the Executive Committee team, I had several jobs. I did get to chair the Publishing Council again, and I, of course, chaired the Finance Committee as treasurer, and chaired the President-elect Advisory Committee as President-elect. And so you get all those jobs as you go up to the presidency. So it's a heck of an experience. It
really
is. And wonderful people.
Yeah.
I had an executive committee that was simply out of this world, with David Butler right behind me, who's now, of course, a presidential member, as am I, with Damon Gowan right behind him, with Don Rich, who's incoming president, our current president, Damon Gowan. I ought to get that on the tape, I guess. With all those people on my executive committee, I couldn't miss.
You couldn't miss. Well, I remember in those years you had one of the things that came from Lou Flagg was let the process work, and you had a theme also for your presidency, which was what?
Communications.
Communications. That's right.
Formula for progress.
Okay.
And I really put the heat on communications. But I did have a couple of other slogans that worked pretty well for me, and one of them was let the process work. And that came to pass because I had a bunch of eager beavers that wanted to make some changes in the organization right in midstream. They wanted to change the whole Education Council around, change the Energy and Technical Affairs Committee, and just reorganize. And it was so important they wanted to do it right now. And I said, oh, wait a minute. You know, we got a process here. We got budgets and systems and procedures and everything. What's such a big rush? Why don't we let the process work? And that phrase stuck. And I was able to use it in many, many situations, and served me well.
Served you well.
The other slogan that I guess caught on kind of was in my opening speech. You know, you kind of look for a gimmick when you're going in, because everybody's got to have a slogan or something. It so happens that I gave a speech at Kansas State University when I was president-elect to the student branch there. And who was in charge of that but Dick Hayter, who's currently a vice president. And Dick's such an impressive guy and done so many great things for the society that I don't know why, but I just said in the course of that speech, look, if a guy like Lou Flagg, who has not been president of any corporation and doesn't run his own business, you know, just ordinary kind of engineer, sure, a little management experience and so on, but primarily an engineer, if he can get to be president of ASHRAE, if it can happen to me, it can happen to you. And Dick, look out, you're liable to be president one of these days. And I bet he will be.
And I'll bet one of those students might well be.
I'll bet one of them.
Probably more than one. And that's an interesting handoff from that level.
And so that little catch phrase caught on, and several times I got reminded of that, and that was fun.
That's fun. Well, we certainly have been aware in this meeting of a growing awareness on the part of engineers across the board and engineers in our society in particular of the need to reach out very strongly to young students, and I mean young students.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, 7th grade and below, to where we can influence or we can reach that young mind in its formative stages and let the idea and the magic and the excitement of our science and technology spark that intellect. And we're going to see more effort, I'm sure.
Give a lot of credit to current President Gowan for his emphasis on the education business, and to a great extent before him, Dave Butler. They jointly picked up on that, and they're making wonderful moves in that direction. And I foresee great things coming out of ASHRAE in the education field.
Yes, I think we've got challenges, and we've got some people that will rise to the challenge.
And if you will interview some people like Jack Chaddock and Chuck Sepsi, past presidents who are still active with us and in the education field, I'm sure you'll hear more than I can the importance of that from the academia side of it.
Yes, and we've had the opportunity to interview Jack and Chuck. We will.
You've had them both on.
Well, not both. Chuck, we have yet to do, but we'll get to those. One at a time. One at a time. Lou, now look back at your presidency with the idea in mind of picking out highlights for you personally and highlights for the society.
Well, I had the pleasure of seeing Standard 62 almost buttoned up. If it hadn't been for an appeal kind of thing, it would have been. Also, that's the one on indoor air quality.
Indoor air quality, okay.
And then Standard 90.1, which is energy conservation, and it was almost buttoned up. If it hadn't been for an appeal, it would be. Both of those came through the next year, so I felt very good about where we got to in terms of those two products. We had been badgered by industries that were not very happy with the restrictions that we were putting into the system.
You mean there was actual controversy in the formation of these?
I'm afraid so. The IAQ had the tobacco industry right on our backs all the way, and there were people that were saying we ought to give in to them, and there were people saying don't you dare, and we stood our ground on that one. And
take a moment and describe that process. Now, here you're talking about a major industry that we're all familiar with, being anxious about the actions that ASHRAE was beginning to take. And how would they be given a hearing? How is that process done within ASHRAE?
Our standards are developed with open committee meetings. We don't close the door and keep people out. So the tobacco industry made sure they knew when we were having meetings, and they either were there with their representatives directly or they had lawyers come to our meetings. Now, they didn't have voting power and that sort of stuff, but they were there and by implication. And that bothers them. And as you carry on down the pike, if you go ahead and defy them, so to speak, as we have done with our standards, because one of the things that I preached in my speeches was we will do the right thing. We will do what's right for the industry and for the world in general, not what's wanted by a specific segment of the industry. So get off our backs. And they wouldn't get off our backs, but we did what was right anyway. And that created some problems for us. But we stood our ground, and I was proud of ASHRAE.
Yes, little old ASHRAE stood their ground. Great. What's the result of that been in your mind, looking back on that? Because we did put a mark on the wall, and the standards did specifically address cigarette smoke in a not too favorable way.
I think we've been one of the contributing factors to all of the no smoking stuff that's gone on in this world, and it's certainly gaining momentum all the time. How much credit we can take for it, I do not know, but I'm sure that we made our mark, and if we'd given in, it would have taken a lot longer for the world to get to where it is today. So I'm pretty proud of ASHRAE for that.
I think we're all proud of that in retrospect. Think now in terms of personal little anecdotes during your presidency, events that pleased you or displeased you, or something that you might relate here?
Well, I had kind of a fantastic year in many ways. Probably the biggest single thing to be pleased about was that I could go through a whole year with 40 trips under my belt, my wife taking 20 of them, and we never got sick one day.
Oh, that's
amazing, amazing, amazing. And I got to say,
thank you,
good Lord. It's just one of those things.
40 trips.
40 trips.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in Atlanta because
it's just about one a week.
I did, yeah. I wasn't working at the time. I had retired from Honeywell. So I didn't have a secretary. I didn't have a duplicating machine. I did have a fax machine furnished by ASHRAE, and I burned up the fax wires. But I needed to spend more time in Atlanta, perhaps, than other presidents will, because of my retired situation. But it worked well for me. I'm not saying if you're retired you can't be president of ASHRAE. I think it worked well. I didn't have any business limitations. 4 of those trips were overseas and went to 5 different locations over there. London, The Hague, Stockholm, Frankfurt, Milan. All of them pretty impressive. I guess the only bad day I had was the CFC, the Chlorofluorocarbon Conference in Milan, where they told me it was going to be simultaneous translation. And it was for my speech. And the rest of the day was in solid Italian. And I can tell you that was tough. But they made up for it. They took me out to a big dinner and gave me the usual presents and wonderful relationships. I think the biggest overall feel I got from my presidency was the rapport we have everywhere we go. Boy, are we, ASHRAE, accepted as an important and outstanding organization. One of my classics was I went to the meeting of the National Society of Professional Engineers, NSPE. And we're just one little segment in the whole professional engineering group, you know. But they let me talk to the group, and originally set up for 10 minutes. But the guy who came on before exceeded his time by about twice, and so they said, "Lou, can't you hurry it up or something? We're running way behind." So I cut it to 3 minutes, but I told them how great our relationship was. To my amazement, their president got up and talked for 5 minutes about our wonderful relationship. And you just got to be proud all over with that kind of reaction everywhere we went. The Swedes in Stockholm, I was on a program called Healthy Buildings 88, and we were right in there as one of the most important elements of that. At REVA, that's the umbrella organization for heating, ventilating, air conditioning societies in Europe, in their 25th anniversary. Again, we really were King Bee at their 25th anniversary celebration. Those are really exciting moments.
Yes.
And I had those kind of experiences with all kinds of sister societies here in the States. 3 or 4 refrigeration type societies. Council of Engineering Council.
Lou, when we left, we were talking a little bit about the respect that the ASHRAE as a technical society receives from sister technology societies and with brother societies over across the oceans and in foreign lands.
Right.
And you've been in a fortunate position to experience some of that. What kind of message do you think it holds for the young engineer in the chapter these days? What would you say to him?
Well, I think that he ought to recognize, he or she ought to recognize, and I would hope we get some more she's into this.
You and I both.
Recognizes that we are not just a local chapter that's a bunch of people that they see at the monthly chapter meeting, but that we really are a worldwide international society, and that people are really quite anxious to relate with us. A lot of them come to our meetings, and we are more and more going to their meetings and spreading our influence around the world. And that as a result, they should join ASHRAE and participate in such wonderful experience. I don't know how you can convince them to relate to that other than through pride of ownership, so to speak.
Well, I think one of the duties of a person in the engineering profession, if it is to be a profession, is to feed back to your profession, to give something back. And ASHRAE is is a marvelous vehicle. I think the way you've related your walk in ASHRAE, it was never any big step, but always a continuous process of working on this committee, getting involved at the chapter level. There's all kinds of little tasks to do within ASHRAE.
And you can never tell where it leads. One of the kind of exciting experiences for me as president was in Chicago when Honeywell had a press conference. And lo and behold, the PR person for Honeywell called me up and said, "Hey Lou, will you introduce the president of ASHRAE, president of Honeywell, to the press?" I said, "Will I ever? I'll be right over." What a thrill for me, you know.
Yeah, that's great.
Working for Honeywell, you're kind of small fish in big pond, and all of a sudden you're the big fish, and that's kind of thing can happen if you let ASHRAE do it, and you grow with ASHRAE.
And let the process work.
Let the process work.
That's great.
And I got to tell you that I grew up, as you may know, loving helping other people. I learned that through scouting and being a scoutmaster, et cetera, and all my life have enjoyed it through church work and ASHRAE work. And ASHRAE gives you that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Everywhere you turn, you can be helpful to somebody, and they accept it with great praise and willingness to reciprocate. And it's just a marvelous organization. I can't say enough about it.
Well, that's great. And I think your participation in the organization is exemplary of the kind of things that make the organization something that we all have pride in.
Well, thank you.
Now, let's depart a little bit from your presidency per se, if we can. You want to do that?
Sure.
And ask you to now. Doubtless you just didn't have anything to do after you were president. They let you go, right?
Oh, sure.
Look back now. You're a little ways out of your presidency, and tell us about your activities since then.
Well, fortunately for me, being retired, I wasn't anxious to go off the edge of the cliff like they talk about happening when you get through with the presidency. So I made it clear that I was available. So before I knew it, I was on 5 committees. A couple of them are automatic. You go in as vice chair of the nominating committee to give you a year of experience before you chair it. And you go into the long-range planning committee to get 2 years of experience before you chair it. And so I've just been through that process. But they also put me on the Centennial Committee, probably because of my long years of experience, or my age, or both. And made me a consultant to the History Committee because I do have a bit of knowledge of history. And then put me on an ad hoc committee for research endowment. And we're about to establish an endowment program at ASHRAE, which is badly needed, I think.
Super.
And so they're keeping me busy.
So the picture we're getting here is the committee seats and chairs have led up to the chairs leading to the presidency, and after you get into the presidency, you have chairs on out for several years.
Well, for at least for a couple of years, guaranteed, and then the rest is kind of up to you and the incoming president. So if you make enough noise, as I tend to do, you probably get on more committees. So at past president's luncheon, breakfast this morning, I don't know if you know we do that. At each of these meetings, we get all the past presidents together, and gee whiz, there must be about 20 of us. It's just an exciting get-together.
There's no kidding at all. It's a pretty serious luncheon.
It is serious. It really is. And so we got on the subject of metrication, and I made the mistake of pointing out that I served as chair of an ad hoc committee to decide on going dual units back in the mid-'70s somewhere. And the incoming president says, I think I know now where to get somebody for a Metric committee.
So
that's the way things can happen. If you just let them know that you're interested, first thing you know, you'll be there. And I expect they'll keep me busy. I was amazed to get the job of installing the officers at lunch yesterday, and even more amazed to get the job of being MC at the banquet tonight.
Well, see there.
There you are.
Yeah, I mean, from introducing the president of Honeywell to the press, you've got a career as an MC.
Oh my.
Well, now I think perhaps we have reached the point where we'll give you a chance to make whatever points about people or about the organization you'd like to make in closing. And
okay. As you well know, it's a very people-oriented organization, and you are influenced in so many ways by those people over the years. One of the stories I tell is when I chaired a technical committee on controls. We found ourselves talking to each other and wondering how the heck we were going to get the expansion of the committee, because it was just control companies, and we wanted to do more than that. And in walked Roger Haynes and Maury Markle one night, and I said, "Come in." And made them members of the committee. They weren't from control companies. And those two guys followed me around up to the channels of publications, et cetera, and Maury Markle's been on the board the last 3 years. Roger Haynes has written a book on controls. It's that kind of thing, you know. The effect of Hay Murray on me back in 57 and all of the follow-up to that. All the past presidents that I've been associated with and how I've interfaced with them over the years, it's beyond description.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you described it well for something being beyond description. There's no contrived mechanism that you work in ASHRAE. ASHRAE kind of comes and gets you if you make yourself available.
Yes.
And gives you challenges and opportunities. Well, you paint a very interesting picture, Mr. Lou Flagg, and thank you for taking time. I know with just what you described with the committees you're working on, it's very difficult for you to take this kind of time to share your reminiscences about your presidency. But we thank you for that.
It's been my pleasure.
And we'll look forward to doing this again when you get into another set of chairs.
Thank you for what you're doing, Mike. I think it's great.
Thank you, sir.